The change began with the weather. A storm had rolled through the Berkshires the previous night. A heavy, relentless system that hammered rain against the roof of my cabin until dawn. The old timbers of my home creaked under the assault. A reminder of how small our shelters are against the true scale of the elements. I lay awake listening to the wind, feeling the vibrations of the thunder in my chest. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine needles. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, innocent and clear, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. My task for the day was routine. I needed to patrol the Felton Trail, checking for washouts or fallen trees that might pose a hazard to hikers. It was a path I had walked hundreds of times, a moderate route that wound through sections of old-growth forest and past the crumbling stone foundations of long-forgotten farms. I knew every twist of the trail, every route that jutted out to catch a boot, every rock that marked a turn. It was familiar territory, a comfort to a man who valued order. But as I hiked about 2 miles in, I stopped. The rhythm of my walk was broken by a detail that did not fit. The trail ahead, usually a single, unbroken line curving around a hillside, had split. There was a fork in the path that I simply did not remember. To the left was the way I knew. To the right was a divergence, a subtle, narrow path leading down into a denser part of the wood. My rational mind immediately sought a logical explanation. The storm must have carved a new channel, washing away the leaf litter to create the illusion of a path. I approached it, expecting to see eroded soil and exposed roots. Instead, I found packed earth. It looked established, deliberate, as if it had been there for years, simply waiting for me to notice it. The vegetation on either side was undisturbed, framing the way perfectly. Curiosity is a dangerous thing for a ranger who works alone, but I have always been driven by a need to understand. I checked my map. There was no trail marked here. Nothing but green contour lines indicating steep, forested terrain. Always a scientist, I whispered to myself, adjusting the straps of my pack. I decided to follow it, just for a few hundred yards, to see where it led. The path took me downhill, into a section of the forest where the trees grew ancient and thick. The light dimmed, filtered through a canopy that seemed reluctant to let the sun reach the forest floor. The silence here was different, deeper, heavier. The usual sounds of the woods, the chatter of squirrels and the call of birds, faded away completely. After 15 minutes of walking through ferns that brushed against my waist, the trees suddenly parted. I stepped into a clearing and froze. There, nestled in a perfect bowl of earth where my map said there should be only solid ground, was a lake. It was roughly 200 yards across, the water a deep, inky black, but it was a stillness that stopped my heart. The surface was like a pane of dark glass, absolutely motionless. No wind rippled it. No life disturbed it. It sat there in the silence, a perfect, impossible mirror reflecting the sky, waiting for someone to look into it. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're finding value in these accounts, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's begin. My name is Michael Torres, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades wearing the uniform of a park ranger in the deep, quiet expanse of October Mountain State Forest. If you have ever driven through the Berkshires in western Massachusetts, you know that the silence here is different. It is not empty. It is a heavy, waiting thing that settles over the 16,000 acres of wilderness under my care. I know these ridges. I know the way the light filters through the hemlocks in the late afternoon. And I know the hidden bends of the streams that do not appear on any tourist map. For 15 years, this forest was my sanctuary. I believed I understood its logic. I believed that if I respected the land, it would offer me clarity in return. I was wrong. I am sharing this account now not because I expect you to believe me, but because the burden of keeping it silent has become too heavy to carry. In October of 1989, I discovered something that defied the laws of nature as we understand them. It was a discovery that challenged my perception of reality, a moment where the world I knew simply stopped making sense. If I am right about what I found in those woods, then our understanding of existence is far more fragile than we dare to admit. And if I am wrong, then this is merely the rambling of a man who spent too much time alone in the company of trees. Either way, the story must be told. I came to the mountains seeking solitude. 3 years before the event, my life in Boston had unraveled. A marriage of 15 years had ended quietly in a lawyer's office, leaving me with a hollow feeling that the city noise could no longer fill. I traded my desk job for a cabin in the woods, seeking the predictability of nature. Trees do not lie. Mountains do not make promises they cannot keep. I found comfort in the routine of the patrol, in the physical exertion of hiking, and in the simple, honest cycle of the seasons. I thought I had found peace. I thought I had escaped the complexities of the human world. But the forest has a memory, and it keeps secrets that are older than any of us. October Mountain is beautiful in the fall, a sea of red and gold leaves that stretches to the horizon. It was during this season, when the air turns crisp and the shadows grow long, that the forest decided to show me something hidden. I woke up that morning believing I was a man in control of his destiny, a scientist at heart who trusted in maps and compasses. By sunset, I would be a man questioning the very ground beneath his feet. This is how it began, not with a shout, but with a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my boots sinking slightly into the damp moss that carpeted the forest floor. The transition from the dense, tangled undergrowth to this open space had been abrupt, like stepping from a crowded room into a vast, empty hall. Before me lay the water, a dark, silent expanse that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was roughly circular, perhaps 200 yards across, nestled in a depression of the land that felt strangely artificial, as if a giant hand had pressed a thumb into the earth long ago. The trees surrounding the perimeter were ancient sentinels, their gnarled roots twisting down into the water, drinking from a source that, according to every official record in my pack, did not exist. I remember taking a breath, expecting the crisp, pine-scented air of the mountains, but the air here was different. It was cold, still, and devoid of scent. It felt sterile, preserved like the air inside a museum case. I scanned the shoreline, looking for the usual signs of life that accompany a body of water in the wild. Normally, a mountain lake is a hub of activity. There should have been dragonflies darting over the surface, water striders creating tiny dimples in attention, the occasional ripple of a fish rising to feed. There should have been the sound of frogs, the rustle of waterfowl in the reeds. But there was nothing. The silence was absolute. It was a silence that felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums, a physical weight that made me conscious of the blood rushing in my own veins. The water itself was the most unsettling element. It was a deep obsidian blue, so dark it appeared black in the center. But it was a stillness that truly captured my attention. I have seen calm lakes before, in the early morning before the wind picks up, but there's always a movement, a subtle undulation, a vibration from the earth, the drift of a fallen leaf. This water was perfectly, impossibly flat. It looked like a sheet of polished black marble or a pool of frozen ink. It did not look like liquid. It looked like a solid object that had been poured into the earth and left to harden. I found myself staring at it, mesmerized by the sheer perfection of its surface. It was beautiful in a stark, unnerving way, a kind of beauty that felt cold and indifferent to human presence. I pulled my map from my pocket again, unfolding it with hands that felt clumsy in the cold air. I traced the contour lines of Sector 7, the area where I stood. My finger moved over familiar topography, the ridge of the mountain, the curve of the Felton Trail, the steep drop-offs into the valley. According to the map, I was standing in a dense patch of hardwood forest. There was no blue ink here, no symbol for water. I checked my GPS unit, waiting for the satellite connection to stabilize. The coordinates flashed on the small gray screen, confirming exactly where I was. The technology insisted I was standing on dry ground, surrounded by trees. My eyes told me I was standing on the shore of a lake that could swallow a household. The disconnect between the data and the reality was disorienting. As a ranger, I relied on these tools. They were my anchors in the wilderness. When the map says one thing and the world says another, it creates a fracture in your confidence, a small crack where doubt begins to seep in. I decided to radio the station. I needed a human voice, a tether to the world outside this silent clearing. I unclipped the radio from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Base, this is Torres. You copy?" The static that answered me sounded loud in the quiet air. After a moment, Jane Klein's voice cut through, clear and familiar. "Copy, Torres. What's up?" Hearing her voice was a relief. It grounded me. "I found a body of water off the Felton Trail," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "About 2 miles in down a side path. It's not on any of our maps. You got any records of a lake in Sector 7? There was a pause on the other end. I could imagine Jane sitting at the dispatch desk, surrounded by the hum of computers and the smell of stale coffee, checking the digital logs. "Negative, Torres," she said finally. "Sector 7 is all forest. No bodies of water larger than seasonal streams. You sure you're not seeing a flooded quarry or maybe some storm runoff?" I looked at the vast expanse of water in front of me. It was too large, too deep, too permanent to be runoff. "I'm looking at a lake right now, Jane. Maybe 200 yards across. Deep from the looks of it. It's very still." The silence on the radio stretched longer this time. "That's odd," she said, her voice tinged with confusion that mirrored my own. "You sure you're reading your GPS right?" I checked again. "Positive. I'm right where I think I am. The lake just isn't on the map. I'll check it out and file a report. Just want to see if we had any records." Torres out. I clipped the radio back onto my uniform. The conversation had not provided the clarity I hoped for. If anything, it deepened the mystery. I was standing in front of a geographical impossibility. A lake of this size does not just appear overnight, and it does not simply vanish from decades of survey data. It had to be old. The way the shoreline was established, with large, smooth stones worn down by centuries of gentle lapping, suggested it had been here for a very long time. Yet it was unknown. It was a secret that the mountain had kept hidden, tucked away in a fold of the landscape where no one looked. I approached the water's edge carefully. The ground near the shore was rocky, a collection of gray slate and granite that crunched softly under my boots. I stopped just a few feet from the waterline. From this vantage point, the reflection on the surface was even more striking. It mirrored the sky above, a pale, cloudless blue, and the towering trees on the opposite bank with a fidelity that was startling. It was flawless. Every branch, every leaf, every variation in the bark of the trees was rendered in high definition on the black glass of the water. It was hypnotic. I found myself getting lost in the details of the reflection, studying the image of the forest inverted in the deep. But as I stared, a subtle unease began to creep up my spine. It was a physical sensation, like the prickle of electricity before a thunderstorm. Something about the scene was wrong. My brain, trained in observation and pattern recognition, was picking up on a discrepancy that my conscious mind had not yet identified. I looked from the real trees to the reflected trees, back and forth, trying to spot the difference. The colors were identical. The shapes were identical. The lighting was identical. And yet, the feeling of wrongness persisted, growing stronger with every second I spent gazing into the depths. It was a feeling you get when you walk into your own home and realize someone has moved a piece of furniture a few inches. Everything looks familiar, but the spatial relationship is slightly, undeniably off. I crouched down, bringing my face closer to the surface. The water was so clear that for a moment, I couldn't tell where the air ended and the liquid began. It was like looking through a window into another world. And that is when I saw it. The realization hit me with a slow, dawning horror that made my breath catch in my throat. The reflection was not just a mirror image. It was inverted in a way that defied physics. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, certain that it was an optical illusion, a trick of the angle or the light. But the image remained the same. The trees on the north shore, the ones directly across from me, appeared in the reflection on the south side. The sky, which had been reflected at the top of the water's surface from my perspective, was at the bottom. It took my mind a long moment to process what I was seeing. A normal reflection flips the image vertically. Up becomes down. If you stand on a bank, your feet are closest to you in the reflection, and your head is furthest away. But this was different. It was as if the reflection had been rotated or turned inside out. It was like looking at a photograph of the forest that had been flipped horizontally and vertically at the same time. The geography of the reflection did not match the geography of the real world. The tall pine tree that stood to my left on the opposite bank appeared on the right in the water. The dip in the ridge line that was to the east was reflected in the west. I stood up slowly, backing away a step. My scientific mind was scrambling for a foothold. I had taken geology courses. I had read about atmospheric refraction, about mirages, about the strange optical properties of mountain lakes. But this did not fit any model I knew. Mirrors do not rearrange the world. They simply reflect it. This water was doing something else. It was reordering the landscape, presenting a version of reality that was structurally impossible. The silence of the clearing seemed to deepen, pressing in on me. The stillness of the water now felt less like tranquility and more like a held breath, a pause in the normal flow of time. I looked around at the real forest, half expecting it to flicker or change, to reveal itself as the illusion. But the trees stood solid and real. It was the water that was the anomaly. It was the water that was lying to me. Or perhaps, and this was a thought that made my hands tremble slightly, perhaps the water was the only thing telling the truth. The discovery of the inverted reflection created a fissure in my understanding of the moment. It was a subtle break, a hairline fracture in the logic of the afternoon, but was enough to let the cold dread seep in. I stood there on the rocky shore, the silence of the forest amplifying the racing of my own thoughts. I needed to test this. I needed to prove to myself that this was simply a misunderstanding of perspective, a complex trick of light and shadow that my eyes were misinterpreting. I was a rational man. I dealt in facts, in tangible evidence. I could not simply accept that a lake was reflecting the world backward. I stepped closer to the water again, moving with a hesitation that was foreign to me. I had walked these woods for years, confident and sure-footed, but now I felt like an intruder in a space where the rules of physics were merely suggestions. I reached out a hand toward the surface. The water looked inviting in a strange, abstract way, smooth, dark, and flawless. I wanted to touch it, to break that impossible stillness, and force the world back into a recognizable pattern. I wanted to see ripples. I wanted to see the reflection distort and shatter, proving that it was just water, just liquid, subject to the same laws as everything else. My fingers hovered inches above the surface. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that was far more intense than the ambient air temperature. It was the kind of cold you feel when you open a deep freezer, a dry, biting sharpness. I took a breath and lowered my hand. The moment my fingertips broke the surface tension, a shock ran through my arm. It was an electric shock, but a thermal one. The water was agonizingly cold. It was colder than ice water, colder than the mountain streams in January. It felt like liquid nitrogen, a cold so profound it burned, but it was the texture that made me recoil. It did not feel like water. It felt thick, viscous, like dipping my hand into heavy syrup or very thin oil. There was a resistance to it, a sluggishness that shouldn't have been there. I pulled my hand back instinctively, gasping at the sensation. I stared at my fingers. They were numb, the skin pale, but they were dry. The substance, whatever it was, had left no residue. There were no droplets clinging to my skin, no wetness. It had simply slid off, leaving only the biting memory of the cold. I wiped my hand on my trousers, a reflex more than a necessity, trying to scrub away the feeling of that alien texture. And that is when I saw the movement. I was looking down at the water, at the place where I had disturbed the surface. I expected ripples. I expected concentric circles spreading out, distorting the inverted trees, breaking the perfect mirror. But the surface remained smooth. It had sealed itself instantly, leaving no trace of my intrusion. The stillness was unbroken. However, in that dark, glassy surface, my reflection was there. It was looking up at me, and it moved. It happened in a heartbeat, a fraction of a second that stretched into an eternity in my mind. I had pulled my hand back. I was standing still, clutching my numb fingers, but my reflection was still reaching out. For a split second, a delay that was perceptible, undeniable, the Michael in the water was still extending his hand, fingers breaking the surface, while the real Michael was standing upright. Then, like a video feed catching up to a live broadcast, the reflection snapped back to match my position. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the loose stones. A primal alarm was ringing in the back of my brain, a lizard brain warning that screamed predator, danger, wrong. This was impossible. Reflections are instantaneous. They are light. Light travels at speeds we cannot comprehend in a casual setting. There is no delay in a mirror. There is no lag in reality. Yet I had seen it. I had seen my own image acting out a moment that had already passed for me. I stood 10 feet back from the shore, chest heaving, staring at the water. The reflection stared back. It looked normal now. It showed me standing there, looking frightened, looking confused. But the trust was broken. I raised my right hand slowly, deliberately. I watched the water like a hawk. The reflection raised its left hand. Good. That was normal mirror behavior. But then, I lowered my hand quickly. The reflection hesitated. It was tiny, a microsecond. If I hadn't been looking for it, I might have missed it. But it was there. My hand was at my side, and for a heartbeat, the reflection's hand was still descending. It was lagging. It was not a true reflection. It was a mimic. It was something that was watching me and copying me. But it needed time to process the movement. The implications of that thought crashed into me with the force of physical blow. A reflection is passive. It is physics. This felt active. This felt like observation. I began to pace along the shoreline, keeping a safe distance from that dark edge. My mind was racing, trying to construct a hypothesis that didn't involve madness. Was it an atmospheric condition? Was the air density above the lake causing a refraction delay? I knew it sounded ridiculous even as I thought it. Light doesn't slow down like that. Not here. Not in a forest in Massachusetts. I walked to the far side of the clearing, needing to see the lake from another angle, needing to find something solid to anchor myself to. That's when I found the sign. It was nailed to a rotting post near the tree line, half obscured by overgrown laurels. It was a wooden board, gray and weathered, the grain raised by decades of exposure. The paint was faded, peeling away in long strips, but the carved letters were still legible, protected by the depth of the grooves. I brushed away a spiderweb and leaned in to read it. Felton Lake. No swimming. EST 1923. I stared at the date. 1923. Over 60 years ago. This lake, this impossible body of water that appeared on no modern map, had been established and named more than half a century ago. Someone had been here. Someone had built this sign. Someone had known about Felton Lake. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. How does a lake exist for 60 years and vanish from the record? How does a state forest lose a landmark of this size? I looked from the sign back to the water. The lake sat there, indifferent to my confusion, holding its secrets in that terrible, perfect stillness. I needed proof. I needed to document this. If I went back to the station with just a story about inverted reflections and time delays, Jane would think I was cracking under the stress of the divorce. She would suggest I take some time off, maybe see a therapist. I couldn't let that happen. I needed hard evidence. I pulled my camera from my pack. It was a sturdy 35mm unit I used for documenting trail damage and wildlife. I checked the settings, ensuring the exposure was correct for the dim light of the clearing. I started taking photos. I photographed the sign, making sure the date was visible. I photographed the lake from the south, capturing the sweep of the shoreline. Then, I moved to the water's edge to capture the anomaly. I framed the shot carefully, focusing on a distinct dead tree on the opposite bank and its inverted reflection in the water. I wanted to capture the geometry of it, the impossibility of the angles. I snapped photo after photo, the mechanical click of the shutter loud in the silence. Click, the inverted trees. Click, the black surface. Click, my own reflection, standing there with the camera to my face. I felt a surge of relief as I worked. The camera was objective. The camera didn't have an imagination. It would capture exactly what was there, protons on film, chemistry, and light. Once I developed these, I would have proof. I would show them the inverted world. I would prove that the water defied the maps. As I was winding the film, preparing to pack up, I heard a sound. It came from across the lake. It was a splash, distinct, wet, and clear. I froze, my head snapping up. I scanned the surface of the water. Silence returned instantly. There were no ripples, no expanding rings of disturbance. The water was as glass smooth as it had been when I arrived. Physics demanded ripples. If something splashes, the water moves. But here, nothing moved. The surface remained sealed. But then I looked at the reflection. In the water, on the reflection of the opposite shore, I saw a figure. It was a man in a ranger uniform. It was me. I was looking at my own reflection, supposedly standing on the other side of the lake. But I was here, on this side. I looked across the lake to the real shore. There was no one there. The woods were empty. But in the water, the reflected Michael Torres was standing on the far bank, and he was not holding a camera. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, watching me. I waved my hand, a frantic, testing gesture. The figure in the reflection did not wave back. It stood perfectly still. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised its arm. It didn't wave. It pointed. It extended a finger and pointed directly at me, across the impossible distance of the inverted world. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through my scientific detachment. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was not a geological oddity. This was something else entirely. I shoved the camera into my pack, not bothering to zip it fully. I grabbed my gear, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I backed away from the water, refusing to turn my back on it until I reached the tree line. The figure in the water kept pointing, accusing, watching. I turned and walked fast, not running. I told myself, never run in the woods, back up the path. I moved with urgency that bordered on flight, pushing through the brush, ignoring the branches that whipped against my face. I needed to get back to the main trail. I needed to get back to the world where reflections stayed in mirrors and water moved when you touched it. I didn't stop until I reached the fork, until I was back on the familiar, packed earth of the Felton Trail. Only then did I pause to breathe, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked back down the dark path leading to the lake, but I saw only shadows and trees. The lake was hidden again, tucked away in its pocket of silence, waiting. The walk back to the trailhead felt less like a hike and more like a re-entry into the atmosphere. I moved with a deliberate, forced steadiness, placing my boots carefully on the roots and rocks of the Felton Trail. Try to regain the rhythm that usually came so naturally to me. My heart was still beating a frantic tattoo against my ribs, a physical reminder of the fear that had gripped me by the water. But I forced my breathing to slow. I forced myself to listen to the forest. The sounds of the woods had returned the moment I stepped away from that divergence. A blue jay scolded from a hemlock branch. The wind rustled the dry leaves of the oaks. A distant airplane droned somewhere high above the clouds. These were the sound of the real world, the world of logic and physics, and I clung to them like a lifeline. They were proof that I was back, that I had stepped out of that silent, inverted pocket reality and returned to the place where things made sense. By the time I saw the dull metallic glint of my truck through the trees, the sun had begun its descent. The golden light of the afternoon was deepening into bruised purples and burnt oranges of twilight. The forest, usually my place of solace, now felt vast and indifferent, a landscape that could hide anything in its shadows. I unlocked the truck door and climbed inside. The familiar scent of old upholstery, coffee, and gasoline greeted me like an old friend. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the knuckles white. I didn't start the engine immediately. I just sat in the safety of the cab, staring out through the windshield at the darkening woods, trying to process what I had seen. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned a degree in environmental science and spent decades documenting the natural world, was already hard at work trying to dismantle the memory. It was suggesting fatigue. It was suggesting stress. It whispered that the divorce had taken a greater toll on my psyche than I cared to admit, that the isolation of the cabin was finally causing cracks in my perception. Optical illusion, my mind insisted. A trick of the light on still water. A momentary lapse in judgment. It was a comforting narrative. It was easier to believe that I was momentarily unwell, that I was simply a tired man who needed a vacation, than to accept the alternative. Because the alternative, that the lake was real, that the reflection had moved on its own, that the world could be inverted, was a thought too heavy to hold. I started the engine, the rumble of the motor vibrating through the seat, grounding me. I put the truck in gear and began the drive back to the ranger station. The road wound down the mountain, passing through corridors of trees that were now silhouettes against the fading sky. I drove automatically, my body performing the motions of steering and shifting gears while my mind replayed the image of the figure in the water. I saw it pointing. I saw the delay. I felt the phantom sensation of that viscous, impossible cold on my fingertips. I turned on the radio, needing noise, needing a human voice to fill the cab. The local news station was playing a weather report, talking about a cooling trend and the chance of frost. It was mundane, boring, and utterly beautiful. I listened to it as if it were a symphony, letting the banal details of temperature and barometric pressure wash over me, anchoring me back to the reality I desperately wanted to believe in. When I pulled into the gravel lot of the ranger station, the main office lights were already on, casting warm yellow squares onto the darkening ground. The station was a small complex of buildings near the forest entrance, a place of maps, logs, and coffee pots. It represented order. It represented the bureaucracy of managing nature, the attempt to catalog and control the wild. I grabbed my pack from the passenger seat, feeling the weight of the camera inside. That camera was my salvation. It held the proof. It held the images that would stop my mind from spinning. I wasn't crazy. I had evidence. I had captured the anomaly on film, and once I showed it to someone, once I shared the burden of what I had seen, the world would stop tilting on its axis. I walked into the station, the bell above the door chiming softly. Jane Klein was at the main desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. She was a station manager, a woman of practical intelligence and calm demeanor who had been running the logistics of October Mountain for years. She looked up as I entered, her glasses reflecting the desk lamp. "You're back late," she noted, her voice mild. Then she paused, looking closer at my face. She set her pen down. "Michael, you look pale. Everything okay out there?" I moved the chair across from her desk and sat down heavily. The station smelled of floor wax and old paper, a smell that usually comforted me but now felt suffocatingly normal. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice sounded thin to my own ears. I ran into something strange on patrol." I hesitated, trying to find the words that wouldn't sound like madness. That lake I radioed you about. The one not on the map. Jane leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. The mystery lake. I checked the archives again after you called. There's nothing, Michael. No records of a body of water in Sector 7 since the geological survey in the 50s. Are you sure it wasn't just a flooded sinkhole? The storm last night was heavy. It wasn't a sinkhole, Jane, I said, leaning forward. It was a lake, a deep, established lake with shoreline and old growth trees. And there was a sign, a wooden sign, weathered gray, dated 1923. Felton Lake. It's been there for 60 years. Jane frowned, a small crease appearing between her eyebrows. 1923? That's impossible. We would know about it. The aerial surveys alone would have picked it up. I know, I said. I know it sounds impossible. That's why I took pictures. I reached into my pack and pulled out the camera. My hands were shaking slightly, a tremor I couldn't suppress. I got shots of the lake, the sign, the reflection. I stopped myself before I said the inverted reflection. I needed to ease her into it. I needed her to see the photos first. Something is wrong with that place, Jane. The water, it doesn't move, and the reflection acts strange. It's like a delay. Jane watched me with a look of growing concern. It wasn't the look of someone believing a ghost story. It was the look of a friend worried about another friend's health. Michael, she said softly, you've been pushing yourself hard lately. Ever since the divorce, you've been taking all the extra shifts, spending all your time in the deep woods. Maybe you're just exhausted. Dehydration can do strange things to perception. I'm not dehydrated. I insisted, perhaps a little too sharply. I'm telling you, it's there. I have the proof right here. I held up the camera. We need to develop this role. Right now. Please. Jane sighed, but she nodded. Okay, if it'll make you feel better, we can develop them. The darkroom is open. She stood up, taking the keys from her belt. Let's go see what you found. The station's darkroom was a small, converted closet and basement, smelling of chemicals and dust. It was a relic of an older time, kept functional mostly because a few of us old-timers preferred film to the newer digital cameras that were starting to appear. I worked in silence, my movements practiced and efficient, despite the tremor in my hands. I wound the film onto the reel, placed in the tank, and poured in the developer. The rhythmic sloshing of the liquid was the only sound in the room, a metronome counting down the minutes to my vindication. Jane stood by the door, watching me with that same expression of gentle, pitying concern. She didn't speak, giving me the space to work, for which I was grateful. I needed this process. I needed the chemistry to prove that my eyes hadn't lied. When the timer dinged, I rinsed the film and hung the strip up to dry. I couldn't wait for prints. I grabbed the loop, the small magnifying glass we use to inspect negatives, and switched on the light box. Look, I said, my voice tight with anticipation. Start with frame 10. That's where I found the clearing. I leaned over the light box, the white glow illuminating my face. I brought the loop to my eye and focused on the first negative. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I expected to see the dark shape of the water, the pale rectangle of the sign, the inverted trees. I saw trees. I blinked and adjusted the focus. I saw a dense, tangled forest. I saw the trunks of maples and oaks, the texture of the ferns, the play of light and shadow on the forest floor. But there was no water. There was no lake. I moved the loop frantically to the next frame. Trees. And the next. Trees. I scrolled through the entire strip of negatives, my breath catching in my throat. Every single frame where I had stood on the shore and photographed the lake showed only a continuous, unbroken stretch of woodland. The frame where I had photographed the sign, it showed an old tree trunk, bare and rotting with no sign attached to it. The frame where I had captured my own reflection pointing back at me, it showed a patch of ferns and a few rocks, with no water to reflect anything. No! I whispered. No, that's not right. Michael? Jane stepped closer, looking over my shoulder. It's not here, I stammered, pointing at the strip. I took a picture of the lake right here. I was standing on the shore. I focused on the water. Why is it just trees? Jane took the loop and looked for herself. She studied the negatives for a long time, scanning the strip from end to end. Then she straightened up and looked at me, her eyes filled with profound sadness. Michael, these are just pictures of the woods. There's no lake. There's no sign. But I saw it. I slammed my hand down on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. I stood there, Jane. I touched the water. It was cold. It was viscous. I saw the sign, 1923. I'm not making this up. I believe that you believe you saw it. Jane said, her voice calm and soothing, the tone one uses with a frightened animal or a confused child. But the camera doesn't lie, Michael. You were in the woods. You were tired. Maybe you fell asleep for a minute. Maybe it was a dream. It wasn't a dream, I said, backing away from the light table. The betrayal of the camera cut deeper than the fear of the lake. The machine, the objective observer, had sided with the gaslighting reality. It had erased my experience. I know what I saw. Go home, Jane said gently. Please, Michael, go back to your cabin. Take a hot shower, eat a real meal, and sleep. We can talk about this tomorrow. You're exhausted. You're seeing things that aren't there because your mind is trying to tell you to rest. I looked at her, looked at the damning strip of negatives, and realized there was nothing I could say that would convince her. To her, I was a man having a breakdown. I grabbed my camera and the negatives, shoving them into my pocket. Okay, I said, my voice hollow. Okay, I'll go home. The drive back to my cabin was a blur. I don't remember the road. I don't remember unlocking my front door. The next thing I knew, I was sitting at my kitchen table. The negatives spread out before me under the harsh light of the overhead lamp. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, but I didn't drink it. I just stared at the images. I used my own magnifying glass, zooming in until the grain of the film dissolved into abstract dots. I was looking for a glitch, a shadow, a hint of the water that had been there. There was nothing. The forest in the photos was seamless. It was as if the lake had never existed. But I couldn't let it go. The memory of that cold, dead water was burned into my nerves. I spent the night in that chair, going over the photos again and again, trying to find a crack in the lie. The silence of the cabin pressing on me, different from the silence of the lake, but lonely in its own way. Outside, the wind picked up, scratching branches against the window pane, sounding like fingers trying to get in. I didn't sleep that night. Or rather, I didn't want to, but exhaustion eventually claimed me, pulling me into a fitful, shallow doze right there at the table. And that was when the dream came for the first time. In the dream, I was back at the lake. The stillness was absolute. I was standing on the shore, looking down, but this time, I wasn't looking at my reflection. I was a reflection. I was looking up through the surface of the water, which was heavy and thick like glass. I could see the real Michael Torres, standing on the bank, looking down at me with terrified eyes. I tried to move, to swim to the surface, but the water held me fast. I was trapped in the inversion, a prisoner in the mirror, and the Michael on the shore, the real Michael, started to smile. It wasn't my smile. It was a cold, knowing curve of the lips that belonged to a stranger. He turned and walked away, leaving me there in the cold dark, screaming soundlessly against the barrier of the surface. I woke up gasping, my heart racing, my hands clutching the edge of the table. The cabin was filled with the gray light of dawn. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, and for a fleeting second, just a heartbeat, my left hand felt numb, cold to the bone, as if I had just pulled it out of freezing water. I rubbed it, trying to bring the warmth back, but the sensation lingered, a phantom memory of a touch that defied reality. The negatives lay on the table, innocent and empty, mocking me with their version of the truth. But I knew better now. The camera had lied. The map had lied. Only the dream felt real. I stayed away from the woods for 3 days. I told myself it was a professional decision, a necessary break to clear my head and reset my biological clock. I told myself that Jane was right, that the stress of the past few years had accumulated into a temporary fissure in my perception, and that all I needed was rest. I spent those days in my cabin, performing mundane tasks with desperate intensity. I cleaned the floors until the wood was strip pale. I organized my books by author, then by subject, then by color. I chopped enough firewood to last through 2 winters. I was trying to fill the silence, trying to occupy my hands and my mind so completely that there would be no room left for the memory of the black water. But the lake did not need my physical presence to haunt me. It had followed me home. The haunting began with the cold. It was a subtle thing at first, a chill that lingered in the tips of my fingers on my left hand. The hand I had dipped into the water. No matter how close I sat to the wood stove, no matter how many layers of wool I wore, that deep, biting cold remained. It was a sensation that felt less like temperature and more like a memory of emptiness, a void that had settled into my bones. I would wake up in the middle of the night rubbing my hand, try to massage warmth back into the flesh, only to find the skin pale and unresponsive. Then came the dreams. I have never been a man given to vivid dreaming. My nights were usually dark and dreamless, a simple shutdown of the system. But now, sleep became a doorway I was terrified to open. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there. I was standing on the shore of Felton Lake, but the perspective was wrong. In the dream, I was not the observer on the bank. I was the observer in the water. I was looking up to the heavy, glassy surface at a distorted world above. I could see the sky, but it was distant and rippling. I could see the trees, but they were twisted, and I could see myself, the real Michael Torres, standing on the edge, looking down with an expression of terrified confusion. In these nightmares, I was paralyzed. I was suspended in a medium that was thicker than water, something that held me in a cold, gelid embrace. I wanted to scream, to pound against the surface, but I had no voice. I had no breath. I could only watch as the version of me on the shore turned and walked away, leaving me trapped in the inversion. I would wake up gasping, my sheets soaked in sweat, the taste of stagnant water filling my mouth, a metallic, ancient taste that made me gag. By the 3rd day, the line between the dream and the waking world began to blur. I found myself staring into the mirror in my bathroom for long stretches of time, analyzing my own face. Was that really me? Was the movement of my eyelids perfectly synchronized with my own? I began to test my reflection, blinking rapidly, turning my head quickly, searching for that split-second delay I had seen at the lake. The mirror in the cabin behaved normally, but the trust was gone. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, a pilot operating a vessel that I no longer fully controlled. The pull to return to the lake became a physical ache. It was not curiosity anymore. It was a need. I needed to know if it was still there. I needed to know if the camera had told the truth or if my eyes had. The uncertainty was eating me alive, eroding my sanity faster than the fear ever could. If I went back and found only forest, I would accept that I had broken down. I would drive to the city, check myself into a clinic, and get the help Jane thought I needed. But if I went back and the lake was there, well, at least I would know I was real. On the morning of the 4th day, I packed my gear. I didn't take the camera this time. I didn't want the judgment of the machine. I took a notebook, a pen, and my radio. The drive to the trailhead was mechanical. The forest was shrouded in a heavy mist, the trees looming like gray ghosts out of fog. It was a kind of weather that muffles sound, turning the woods into a padded room. I walked the Felton Trail with a grim determination, ignoring the beauty of the autumn leaves, ignoring the familiar landmarks. I was a man marching toward a verdict. When I reached the spot, the 2-mile marker, My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked for the divergence. I prayed, in a way, that it wouldn't be there. I prayed for an unbroken wall of brush. But the path was there. It was distinct, packed earth winding down into the gloom, just as it had been before. The relief I felt was sickening. I wasn't crazy. The path existed. I followed it, moving slower this time, every step in negotiation with my instinct to run. The air grew colder as I descended. The silence returned, that absolute vacuum-sealed silence that marked the boundary of the anomaly. I pushed through the final barrier of ferns and stepped into the clearing. The lake was there. It lay before me like a vast, dark eye staring up at the gray sky. The water was just as still, just as black, just as impossible as I remembered. The inverted reflection of the forest was perfect, hanging in the abyss. I stood at the tree line, trembling, not from cold, but from the terrifying validation of my own senses. I was right, and being right was the worst possible outcome. I did not approach the water immediately. I stayed back near the safety of the trees, watching the shoreline, waiting for the phenomenon to manifest. The stillness of the lake was mesmerizing, a hypnotic void that seemed to pull at my vision. I scanned the perimeter, looking for the sign I had seen before, the one dated in 1923. It was there, leaning crookedly against the brush, exactly where I had left it. The camera had seen a rotting log. My eyes saw painted wood. The divergence between reality and record was complete. But as I scanned the far side of the lake, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. I was not alone. Standing at the water's edge, perhaps 50 yards away to my right, was a figure. It was a man, dressed in the olive-green uniform of a park ranger. He was standing perfectly still, his back rigid, staring out across the water. My first instinct was relief. Another ranger, a witness. Perhaps Jane had sent someone else to check the sector. Perhaps I wasn't the only one who had found this place. "Hey!" I called out, stepping into the clearing. My voice sounded flat and dead in the damp air, swallowed instantly by the silence. "Hello, Ranger." The figure did not move. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge my presence in any way. He stood like a statue, fixated on the black glass of the lake. I began to walk toward him, my hand instinctively resting on my radio. As I got closer, the details of his appearance began to register, and the sense of wrongness returned. His uniform was outdated, the cut of the jacket, the style of the hat, the patch on his shoulder. It was a regulation kit from decades ago, the kind I had seen in old photographs in the station lobby. It was clean but worn, the fabric faded by sun and time. "Sir," I slowed my pace, approaching him from the side. "Are you all right?" I was 10 feet away when I saw his face. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with gray stubble on his cheeks and skin that looked waxy and pale. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring into the middle distance with a vacuous, empty expression. He was breathing, but barely, shallow, rattling breaths that barely moved his chest. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, left standing by the sheer force of some terrible inertia. "Can you hear me?" I reached out and touched his arm. The moment I made contact, the tension holding him upright seemed to snap. He didn't crumble. He simply dropped, collapsing straight down like a marionette whose strings had been cut. I lunged forward, catching before his head hit the stones, easing him down onto the damp earth. His body was incredibly cold, radiating a chill that pierced through my gloves. "Stay with me," I said, fumbling for his wrist to check for a pulse. It was there, but thready and weak, fluttering like a dying moth. I grabbed my radio, keying the emergency channel. "Base, this is Torres. I have a medical emergency in Sector 7. Unidentified male, unconscious, unresponsive. I need paramedics at the trailhead now. I'm bringing him out." Jane's voice came back instantly, sharp with alarm. "Copy, Torres. EMS is rolling. What's your location?" "I'm at the clearing," I said, realizing I couldn't say the lake. without sounding delusional again. I'm carrying him to the main Felton Trail. Just get them there. I looked down at the man. His eyes were still open, fixed on the sky now, seeing nothing. I prepared to lift him, to hoist him into a fireman's carry. But before I did, I glanced at the water. I don't know why. Perhaps I sensed a movement. The man was lying motionless on the rocks. But in the lake, in that perfect inverted reflection, he was not lying down. In the water, the reflection of the old ranger was standing. He was awake. He was screaming. I couldn't hear him. The silence was absolute, but his face was contorted in a rictus of pure terror. He was pounding his fists against the invisible barrier of the surface, looking up at us, looking up at his own dying body. He was mouthing words, frantic, desperate pleas that were lost in the inversion. I squeezed my eyes shut, a wave of nausea rolling over me. Don't look at it, I told myself. Focus on the man. Focus on the job. I hoisted the unconscious ranger onto my shoulders. He was surprisingly light, as if the substance of him had already eroded away. I turned my back on the lake, on the screaming reflection, and began the grueling hike back up the slope. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I focused on the rhythm of my boots, on the weight on my shoulders, on the sound of the man's shallow breathing near my ear. By the time I reached the main trail, my legs were burning, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. I carried him all the way to the trailhead, where the flashing lights of the ambulance were already cutting through the mist. The paramedics took him from me, laying him on a gurney. They worked quickly, cutting away his jacket, checking his vitals. I stood by the truck, leaning against the hood, gasping for air, watching the flurry of activity. He's gone. One of the medics said quietly after a few minutes. He looked at his watch. Time of death, 10:47 a.m. I felt a heavy stone settle in my stomach. I had been too late. What was it? I asked, walking over. Heart attack. The medic shook his head, looking puzzled. Hypothermia. Severe. His core temp was 82 degrees. It's like he was submerged in freezing water for hours. He paused, touching the man's dry shirt. But he's bone dry, and it's 50 degrees out here. It doesn't make any sense. As they prepared to load the body into the ambulance, the movement shifted the man's jacket, revealing the nameplate pinned to the breast pocket. It was an old style, brass with black lettering, tarnished with age. I leaned in, needing to know the name of the man I had failed to save. Coleman. The name hit me like a physical blow. I knew that name. Every ranger knew that name. Robert Coleman, the ranger who had vanished on patrol in 1962. The man whose disappearance was the station's oldest cold case. He had walked into the woods 27 years ago and never walked out. I stared at the face of the dead man. He hadn't aged. He looked exactly like the photos in the missing person file. A man in his late 50s. If he had been living in the woods for 30 years, he should have been 90. He should have been frail. But he wasn't. He was preserved. He was exactly as he had been the day he disappeared. Do you know him? The medic asked, seeing my expression. No, I lied. My voice was a whisper. I don't know him. They closed the doors of the ambulance, shutting away the impossible corpse. I stood alone in the parking lot as the siren wailed, fading into the distance. Coleman had been missing for decades, and he had just died of hypothermia on dry land, next to a lake that didn't exist, while his reflection screamed for help from the other side. I looked at my own hands. They were trembling violently now. The cold in my left hand flared up a sharp, biting pain. I realized then that Coleman hadn't just been lost. He had been waiting, and now that he was gone, the lake was empty. It was waiting for someone else. The death of Ranger Coleman, or rather, the reappearance of his body after 27 years, marked a turning point. Before that moment, the lake had been an external problem, a geographical anomaly that I could, in theory, walk away from. But Coleman's impossible preservation, the the hypothermia in a dry body, and the screaming reflection I had witnessed. These things suggested that the lake was not just a place. It was a condition. And like any condition, it had symptoms. I returned to my cabin that evening in a state of numbness. The official report I filed was sparse. I wrote that I had found an unidentified hiker in distress who succumbed to exposure. I omitted the name on the badge. I omitted the location of the lake. I omitted the fact that the man had been dead to the world for 3 decades. I knew that once the coroner identified him through dental records or fingerprints, the chaos would begin. But for tonight, I needed to understand what was happening to me. I stood in my bathroom, the harsh fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and stripped off my uniform. I wanted to scrub the feeling of the woods off my skin. I turned on the tap, splashing cold water on my face, try and shock my system back into alignment. As I reached for the towel, I caught a glimpse of my hand in the mirror. My left hand. I froze. Since I was 12 years old, I've had a scar on my left palm. It was a souvenir from a childhood fishing trip, a jagged, 3-inch white line running diagonally from the base of my thumb to the center of my hand. I knew that scar better than I knew my own face. It was a part of my history, a permanent marker of a specific afternoon in my youth. I looked at my left palm. It was smooth. The skin was unbroken, the lines of my life clearly visible, but the scar was gone. A cold sensation, deeper than the chill of the water, washed over me. I turned my hand over, flexing the fingers. Nothing, just unblemished skin. Slowly, with a dread that made my stomach turn, I lifted my right hand. There it was. The scar was on my right palm now. It was identical in shape, length, and texture. The same raised white keloid, the same jagged path, but it was on the wrong hand. I stared at it, my mind reeling. I closed my eyes and tried to access the memory of the accident. I remembered the fishing hook, the slip on the wet rocks, the sharp pain. In my memory, it was my left hand. I was sure of it. I had spent 40 years favoring that hand, protecting the scar tissue. But as I stood there, another memory began to surface, unbidden and terrifying. I remembered the accident happening to my right hand. I remembered holding the rod in my left and slipping, catching myself with my right. The memory was clear, vivid, and completely contradictory to the first one. I now had 2 sets of memories for the same event, both feeling equally real, both claiming to be the truth. I looked at my face in the mirror. Was it my imagination, or was the part of my hair on the opposite side? I touched the small mole on my cheek. I had always had a mole on my left cheek. It was there, solid and real. But didn't I remember shaving around on the right side? I couldn't be sure anymore. The certainty of my own physical form was dissolving. I walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. I needed an anchor. I looked at my hands again. Left, right. The scar mocked me from the wrong side. Then I looked at my ring finger. I had taken off my wedding band 3 years ago, but the faint indentation of the gold was still visible, a pale band of skin where the sun hadn't touched. I was left-handed. I had always worn my watch on my right wrist and my ring on my left. I looked at my left hand. The ring finger was tanned and smooth. No mark. I looked at my right hand. There, on the ring finger, was a pale, ghostly circle of the missing ring. I felt a surge of vertigo, so intense I had to grip the mattress to keep from falling. I was left-handed. I knew I was. But now, the physical evidence of my life, the callus from writing, the tan line from the ring, suggested I had been right-handed all along. Or perhaps, in this new version of reality that was bleeding into mine, I was right-handed. The lake was rewriting me. It wasn't just reflecting the world backward. It was imposing that backwardness onto me. The brief contact I had with the water, the moments I spent staring into the inversion. It was acting like a virus, overriding my biological history with its own mirror image logic. I was becoming a reflection. I was becoming an inverted copy. I spent the rest of the night testing myself. I picked up a pen. My left hand felt clumsy, alien. I switched to my right hand. The pen felt natural, the ink flowing smoothly onto the paper. Michael Torres, I wrote. The signature looked exactly like mine, but it had flowed from the wrong hand. I sat there in the silence of the cabin, staring at the name, realizing that the man who wrote it was not the same man who had woken up that morning. I was shifting. I was sliding sideways into a parallel existence, and I had no idea how to stop it. The next morning, I drove to the station with a singular purpose. The confusion of the night had hardened into a cold resolve. If I was losing my mind, I wanted proof. If I was being rewritten by some geological anomaly, I wanted to know the precedents. Coleman was the key. He had been found at the lake. He had been missing for decades. Whatever was happening to me had happened to him first. I arrived early, before the morning shift fully began. Jane was already there, looking tired and drawn. The news of the body had clearly shaken her, though she was trying to maintain her professional veneer. "Michael," she said as I walked in. "The coroner just called. They're having trouble with the ID. The fingerprints aren't matching anyone in the current database. Check the paper files," I said, walking past her desk toward the stairs that led to the basement archives. "Check the files from the 60s. "Michael, stop," she called after me. "You can't just—" "I need to check something, Jane. Just give me an hour." I didn't wait for permission. I descended into the cool, musty air of the archive room. It was a space that time had forgotten, filled with rows of gray metal filing cabinets that held the history of the forest in endless folders of yellowing paper. Personnel files, incident reports, survey logs, the bureaucratic memory of the Berkshires. I found the drawer marked C, closed/inactive. I thumbed through the tabs until I found it. Coleman, Robert. The file was thin, a meager collection of documents for a man's life. I pulled it out and carried it to the wooden table in the center of the room, sitting under the single hanging bulb. I opened the folder. A black and white photo was stapled to the first page. It showed a younger Coleman, smiling, wearing the uniform I had seen on the corpse. I skipped past the standard employment forms and went straight to the incident logs. I wanted to see his words. I needed to know what he had seen in the days before he vanished. His handwriting was neat, precise, the script of a man who valued order. The early entries were mundane, trail maintenance, weather reports, wildlife sightings. But as I flipped to October 1962, the tone changed. October 15, 1962, found unusual geological formation off Felton Trail. Will investigate further. Requesting surveying equipment from county office. October 17, 1962, surveying equipment delayed. Conduct a preliminary investigation of site. Water sample collected. Highly unusual properties. Recommend immediate hydrological study. I felt a chill of recognition. He had found it. He had walked the same path. October 20th, 1962, water sample sent to state lab. Results pending. Site remains unmarked on official maps. Discrepancy needs addressing. The silence in the clearing is unnatural. October 22nd, 1962, lab results inconclusive. Water composition normal, but isotope ratios are impossible. Lab requesting new sample. Believes contamination of first sample. Isotopes. He had managed to get a sample tested. I made a mental note to follow up on that. October 25th, 1962. Return to site for second sample. Water surface exhibiting unusual reflective properties. Optical illusion. Will document with photographs. October 27th, 1962. Photographs fail to develop properly. All images show forest only. Cannot capture lake on film. Beginning to suspect surveying error in original discovery. I closed my eyes for a moment. The camera. It had failed him too. The gaslighting was consistent. The lake refused to be observed by anything other than the human eye. The entries continued. The handwriting becoming more erratic. The pressure of the pen digging deeper into the paper. October 29th, 1962. Lake definitely present. Multiple visual confirmations, but photographs continue to fail. Equipment malfunction or something else. I field watched, and then the final entry, October 31st, 1962. Halloween, the day before he disappeared. The writing here was shaky, jagged, as if his hand, or perhaps his wrong hand, was fighting him. The lake knows me now. I see myself in the water, but it's not a reflection. It's watching me. It's learning from me. The water wants to understand what I am, and I can feel it studying me. Every time I look at the surface, I lose a little more myself. The reflection knows things I haven't thought yet. Last night, I dreamed I was underwater, looking up at myself standing on the shore. When I woke up, I was dry, but I could taste the water in my mouth. I'm requesting transfer. I can't come back to this lake. If I do, I don't think I'll leave. I sat back in the chair, the silence of the archive room pressing in on me. The lake knows me now. It was the exact phrase that had been echoing in my own mind. Coleman had gone through the same progression. Discovery, denial, obsession, and finally, the terrifying realization that the observer and the observed were switching places. He had tried to leave. He had requested a transfer, but it hadn't saved him. He had gone back. Or perhaps the thing in the lake had come for him. I looked at the date again. 1962, the height of the Cold War, a time of secrets and paranoia. And in the middle of it, a ranger had found a hole in reality and fallen through. I pulled out my phone, the modern device looking out of place next to the yellowed paper. I searched for the number of the State Geological Survey. It was a long shot, but Coleman had mentioned sending samples. Government bureaucracies never throw anything away. If there was a record of those isotopes, it might be the only objective proof that existed. I dialed a number, navigating a maze of automated menus, until I finally reached a human being in the archives division. I explained who I was and what I was looking for. Water analysis reports from October 1962, submitted by Ranger Robert Coleman, the clerk on the other end side, the sound of keys clacking in the background. 1962? That's going to be on microfiche, if we have it at all. Hold on. I waited for 10 minutes, listening to the whole music, staring at Coleman's desperate handwriting. Finally, the clerk returned. Okay, I found a reference. Accession number 89 Alpha. It's flagged. Flagged. I asked, flagged for what? Anomalous results, the clerk read. Sample rejected. Notes say, isotope decay ratios inconsistent with terrestrial hydrology. Water appears to be both primordial and newly formed simultaneously. Impossible readings. Suspected instrument error. Both old and young, I whispered. Temporally inconsistent. Yeah, basically, the clerk said, sounding board. Says here they asked for a resample, but never got one. Case closed. Why are you digging this up? Just trying to close an old file. I said, thank you. I hung up. The science backed it up. The water was wrong. It didn't belong to our timeline. It was a substance that existed outside of normal chronological decay. Coleman had found it, touched it, and it had frozen him in time, trapping him between the seconds. And now, 27 years later, he had washed up on the shore of our reality, a message in a bottle that I was the only one reading. I looked at my right hand, at the scar that shouldn't be there. I was already infected. I was already changing. The lake had touched Coleman, and he had become a ghost. Now it had touched me. I closed the file, the heavy cardboard cover falling with a dull thud. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run. I couldn't transfer. I had to go back. I had to confront the reflection before it finished rewriting me completely. The confirmation from the state lab hung in the air like smoke. Isotope decay ratios inconsistent with terrestrial hydrology. It was a sterile scientific phrase, the kind of language used to distance the observer from the observed, but to me, It was a terrifying validation. The water in that lake was not just water. It was a chronological paradox. I sat in the dim light of the archive room, the phone screen dark in my hand. My mind was racing, connecting the dots between Coleman's disappearance and the physical impossibility of the sample. Isotopes are the clocks of the geological world. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, they all degrade at specific, measurable rates. By measuring these ratios, we can tell how old a sample of water is, how long it has been underground, and when it last saw the sky. But the lab report said the water was both primordial and newly formed. It was billions of years old, older than the mountain itself, yet simultaneously born yesterday. It existed in a state of superposition, refusing to settle into a single point in time. This explained Coleman. The man I had pulled from the shore was physically unchanged from his 1962 self because he'd been immersed or entangled in a substance that did not obey linear time. He hadn't aged because he'd been trapped in the now of the lake, a now that stretched across decades without moving forward. And when he was finally ejected back into our reality, into our linear time, his biology couldn't reconcile the shock. The hypothermia wasn't just from cold. It was a thermal shock of entropy catching up with him all at once. I needed to understand more. The lab clerk had mentioned the sample was flagged as an open scientific anomaly. That meant someone somewhere had cared enough to keep the file active for 30 years. I looked back at Coleman's notes. He had mentioned requesting a hydrological study. He had been trying to follow the proper channels, trying to use the tools of science to explain the inexplicable. But science requires constants, and the lake offered only variables. I left the station archives and drove to the nearest university library in Amherst. The drive took an hour, winding to the valley where the autumn colors were now fading into the dull browns of November. The world outside felt fragile to me now, a thin veneer painted over a much stranger, darker reality. Every time I looked in the rear-view mirror, I checked my reflection. Was it blinking when I blinked? Was it smiling when I frowned? The paranoia was a low-level hum in the back of my skull, a constant reminder that I was no longer alone in my own body. The university library was a fortress of brick and glass, a place of reason and ordered knowledge. I found a quiet corner in the stacks and logged onto a terminal. I wasn't looking for Coleman anymore. I was looking for the lake itself. If it had been there in 1923, if it had been there in 1962, surely others had seen it. A geological feature that defies physics doesn't go completely unnoticed. I started with geological surveys of the Berkshire region. I read through dry reports on granite formations and glacial runoff. Nothing. Then I widened my search to include historical accounts, folklore, and land deeds. I searched for Felton Lake. A hit. It wasn't a map. It was a scanned image of Surveyor's Journal from 1847. The handwriting was elegant, looping script in faded brown ink. The surveyor, a man named Elias Thorne, had been commissioned to map the boundaries for a potential timber operation. September 14, 1847. Progress slowed by difficult terrain in the northern quadrant. The men are uneasy. We encountered a body of water not marked on previous charts, a looking glass pond of considerable depth. The water possesses a singular quality of stillness that disturbs the spirit. Several of the crew complained of dizziness and melancholy after viewing it. One man, a Mr. Harrow, claimed to see the world turned upside down in its depths. I have advised we route the timber road well to the east to avoid this place. It feels unstuck. The word resonated with me. Thorne had felt it too, over a century ago. The feeling that the lake wasn't pinned down to the earth like the rest of the landscape. I kept digging. I found a reference in a local historical society newsletter from 1930. It was a brief mention of a failed settlement near the Felton Trail in the early 1920s. A group of families had tried to establish a small community there. Drawn by the isolation, they had built foundations, cleared land, and even named a lake. But within 2 years, the settlement was abandoned. The article didn't say why. only noting that the soil proved inhospitable to both crops and sanity. The pattern was clear. The lake was a persistent phenomenon, appearing to observers throughout history, always accompanied by a sense of dread and disorientation. It was a trap. It lured people in with its beauty and silence, then infected them with an inverted logic. The no swimming sign from 1923 wasn't regulation. It was a warning, a desperate attempt by those settlers to keep people out of the water before they fled. I sat back in the library chair, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I had the history. I had the science. But none of it told me how to stop what was happening to me. I looked at my right hand, the scar glowing faint white under the library lights. I flexed the fingers. They felt strong, capable, and alien. My body was remembering a history I hadn't lived. I remembered breaking that hand in a fall. I remembered the cast, the itching, the smell of plaster. But I also remembered the fishing hook in my left hand. I was carrying two timelines in one body, and the strain was starting to show. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, the library faded. I was back at the water's edge. I could smell the ozone, feel the cold radiating from the surface, and in the darkness of my mind, I saw the reflection again. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting. It knew that I knew. The game of cat and mouse was over. It was time for the confrontation. As I continued my research in the hushed stillness of the library, I stumbled upon a connection that sent a chill through my veins, colder than the lake water itself. I was cross-referencing the date on the sign, 1923, with other events in the region. The search algorithm threw up a digitized page from a literary journal, discussing the travels of the writer H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft, the master of cosmic horror, the man who wrote about ancient gods and geometries that defied human understanding. I knew his work, of course. Everyone did. But I had always assumed his stories were pure invention, the fevered dreams of a recluse living in Providence. The article detailed a trip Lovecraft took in the summer of 1923. He had visited the Berkshires, seeking inspiration and respite from the city heat. He had stayed in a small boarding house not far from what is now the entrance to October Mountain State Forest. The article included excerpts from his personal letters to a friend. August 4th, 1923. The hills here are ancient brooding things. They hold secrets in their folds that civilization has wisely chosen to ignore. Yesterday, on a hike through the deep woods, I came upon a clearing that filled me with a profound and existential dread. There is a lake there, a pool of black vitriol that mirrors the sky but shows a world that is not our own. I peered into its depths and felt that I was looking not at reflection, but at the true face of the universe, cold, indifferent, and inverted. We are the shadows, my friend. We are the fleeting images cast upon the glass. The reality lies below in the dark, watching us with eyes that have not blinked for eons. I read the passage 3 times. We are the shadows. Lovecraft had seen it. He had stood on the same shore, looked into the same black water, and come to the same terrifying conclusion that I was struggling to accept. His fiction, the stories of Cthulhu, of the color out of space, of dimensions that bleed into ours, wasn't just imagination. It was reportage. He had wrapped the truth in the guise of fantasy, because the truth was too stark to be believed. I searched for more. Did he write anything else about the lake? I found a reference to a discarded draft, a fragment of a story he never finished. It was titled The Inverted Man. The synopsis described a protagonist who finds a pool in the woods and slowly realizes that his reflection has escaped and replaced him in the waking world, leaving him trapped in the mirror. Lovecraft had known. He had understood the mechanism of the lake. It was a duplication machine, a doorway that allowed the things from the other side, the reflections, the shadows, to cross over and inhabit our world. And in doing so, they push the originals out or absorb them or simply erase them. I looked at the date again. 1923, the same year the sign was put up. Had Lovecraft met the settlers? Had he warned them? Or had he simply fled, pouring his terror into his typewriter, hoping that by naming the monsters, he could keep them at bay? This historical validation gave me a strange sense of comfort. I wasn't the first. I wasn't alone in this experience. Elias Thorne, the settlers, Lovecraft, Coleman. We were all part of a lineage of witnesses, but it also filled me with despair, because none of them had won. Thorne had diverted the road. The settlers had abandoned their homes. Lovecraft had retreated into fiction. Coleman had been taken. The lake was undefeated. I left the library as the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the campus lawn. My head was full of dates and names, but my heart was heavy with the realization of what I was up against. I wasn't fighting a ghost or a monster. I was fighting a fundamental flaw in the structure of reality, a leak in the pipe of the universe. I drove back toward the mountains, the silhouette of the Berkshires rising up to swallow the last of the light. I knew I couldn't go back to the station. Jane would only worry, and I had nothing to show her but old letters and impossible lab reports. I couldn't go back to my cabin, either. The silence was too loud, and the mirrors were too many. I pulled my truck over to scenic overlook, gazing out at the vast darkness of the forest. Somewhere in there, 2 miles off the Felton Trail, the lake was waiting. It was a source. It was the eye of the needle. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my gut like lead, that I had to go back. I had to talk to it, not to the water, but to the thing that wore my face. The reflection had communicated with me before. It had pointed. It had smiled. It had shown intelligence. If Lovecraft was right, if we were the shadows and it was a reality, then perhaps I could bargain. Perhaps I could understand what it wanted. Or perhaps, and this was a thought that made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles cracked, perhaps I could trick it. I looked at my hands in the dashlight. Right hand, left hand. The scar on the right was throbbing now, a dull rhythmic ache. It was a beacon, a connection. I wasn't just going back to the lake as an observer this time. I was going back as a part of it. I started the engine, the headlights cutting a bright, lonely path through the dark, and turned the truck toward the trailhead. It was time to finish the conversation. The moon was high when I reached the clearing, casting a pale silver light that made the forest look like a negative photograph. I had walked the path in darkness, guided less by my flashlight and more by a terrifying familiarity. My feet seemed to know the way now, stepping over roots and rocks with a memory that wasn't entirely my own. The air in the clearing was stagnant, devoid of the night sounds that usually fill the woods. No crickets, no owls, just a heavy, suffocating silence of vacuum. I walked to the water's edge, my boots crunching softly on the stones. The lake was a perfect black mirror, reflecting the moon with such clarity that it looked like a hole punched through the earth into another sky. I stood there, breathing in the cold, metallic air, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. In the water, my reflection walked forward to meet me. It didn't mimic my movements this time. I was standing still, my hands at my sides. The reflection walked up from the depths of the inverted forest, stopping just a few feet from the surface line. It looked at me. The face was mine, graying hair, the lines around the eyes, the shape of the jaw, but the expression was one of profound, serene pity. It wasn't the terrified face I had seen in my dreams. It was a face of someone who knew the end of the story. I pulled a notebook and a thick marker from my jacket pocket. I had prepared for this. I couldn't speak to it. Sound didn't seem to cross the barrier, but visual information did. I wrote in large block letters, "What are you?" I held the notebook up to the water. The moonlight illuminated the page. The reflection watched me. Then, slowly, it reached into its own pocket. It pulled out a notebook that looked exactly like mine. It uncapped a marker and wrote. The movement was fluid, practiced. It turned the notebook around. The text was perfectly legible, not mirrored. It had oriented the writing so I could read it. I am the real one. I felt a cold shiver ripple down my spine. I flipped to a new page. I am standing here. I am solid. You are light on water. The reflection smiled. It was a gentle smile, almost fatherly. It wrote again, you are memory, a shadow cast by the true world. The lake is the window. We are the room. I stared at the words. The philosophy was terrifying. It wasn't just claiming to be alive. It was claiming sovereignty over reality. It was telling me that my entire existence, my memories, my pain, the divorce, the cabin, the forest, was just a projection, a fleeting image on a screen. What do you want? I wrote, my hand trembling slightly. The reflection didn't write immediately. It looked at me, scanning my face, my uniform, my trembling hands. Then it put pen to paper. To behold, the barrier is thinning. Soon the glass will break. You feel it, don't you? The cold? The missing time? I dropped the notebook. It hit the stones with a dry clatter. He was right. I did feel it. The cold in my bones, the shifting memories, the scar moving from hand to hand. It was all evidence of the dissolution. I wasn't just losing my mind. I was fading. I was becoming translucent. Why me? I wrote, picking the book up again. Because you looked, the reflection answered. You stopped. You saw. Most pass by. They see a pond and keep walking. You look deep enough to be seen back. I took a step back. The figure in the water took a step forward, pressing against the surface tension. For a moment, the water bulged upward, like a membrane stretching over a face. It wanted out, or wanted me in. I won't let you, I wrote, slashing the exclamation point onto the paper. The reflection laughed. It was a silent laugh, a shaking of the shoulders, but I could feel the vibration of it in the ground. It wrote one last message, pressing hard enough to flatten the tip of the marker. You don't have a choice. You are already me. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the inverted darkness of the trees below, leaving me alone with the moon and the lie of my own existence. I sat on a large boulder near the tree line, watching the empty lake. The conversation had drained me, leaving me hollowed out. The reflection's words echoed in my mind. You are a memory, a shadow. It was a horrific inversion of Descartes. I think, therefore I became I think, therefore I am a simulation. I tried to dismantle the logic. I tried to summon the scientist in me, the skeptic, but the evidence of my own body was betraying me. I looked at my hands again in the moonlight. The scar on my right hand was throbbing with a dull, insistent ache. I tried to remember the accident again. The memory was crisp now. The slip on the rocks, the right hand going out to break the fall, the sharp tear of the skin. The memory of it happening to my left hand was fading, becoming like a dream I had once had, hazy and indistinct. I was being overwritten. That was the only word for it. The entity in the lake wasn't just swapping places. It was rewriting the code of the source material. It was consuming my history and replacing it with its own. And the terrifying part was that its history felt more real. The new memories had a weight, a solidity that my old ones lacked. I began to formulate a theory, a desperate attempt to categorize the impossible. The lake wasn't water. Coleman's isotope report proved that. It was a substrate, a primordial fluid interface that connected two states of being. On one side was our world, chaotic, entropy-driven, linear. On the other side was a still world, eternal, ordered, inverted. Perhaps Lovecraft was right. Perhaps our reality is the reflection. Maybe the Big Bang was just a moment the mirror was shattered, and we are the fragments flying outward, chaotic and confused. And the lake is a piece of the original mirror that remained intact, a place where the order of the pre-universe still holds sway. The entities down there, the reflections, they aren't monsters. They are the originals. They are the templates. And they look up at us, at our messy, painful, short lives, and they see errors. They see glitches. They want to correct us. They want to reabsorb the data that leaked out. To be whole, the reflection had written. It wasn't an invasion. It was a defragmentation. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. If this theory was true, then fighting it was like fighting gravity. You can resist for a while, you can climb, you can fly, but eventually you have to come down. The well of gravity always wins. The lake was a gravity well for reality. But there was a flaw in the reflection's argument. You are a memory, it had said, but memories don't bleed. Memories don't feel fear. I felt fear. I felt the cold rock beneath me. I felt the sharp bite of the autumn wind on my face. These sensations were raw and immediate. They were proof of life. I am real, I whispered to the empty clearing. I feel, therefore I am. I stood up. I wasn't going to let it happen. I wasn't going to be reabsorbed. Even if I was a shadow, even if I was a glitch, I had a right to exist. I had a right to my pain, to my mistakes, to my chaotic, linear life. I needed to break the mirror. I didn't know how to destroy a geological anomaly. You can't shoot a lake. You can't arrest a reflection. But Coleman had tried to get samples. He had tried to treat it like a physical object, and the lake had resisted. It had fought back. I remembered the flare in my emergency kit. It was a magnesium road flare designed to burn at thousands of degrees underwater in wind, in anything. It was pure, concentrated energy. Light and heat. The lake was stillness, coldness, darkness. Perhaps the opposite of the lake wasn't earth or stone. Perhaps it was fire. Violent, uncontrollable, consuming fire. I opened my pack and dug to the bottom compartment until my fingers closed around the cold cylinder of the flare. It felt heavy, substantial, a wand of destruction. I walked back to the shore. The water was still empty, the surface sealed shut. You want to be whole? I said aloud, my voice gaining strength. You want to merge? Let's see how you handle a little entropy. I held the flare in my hand, preparing to strike the cap. I didn't know what would happen. Maybe nothing. Maybe the water would just swallow it, hiss once, and extinguish it. Or maybe, just maybe, introducing a point of intense, chaotic heat into a system of perfect, cold order would cause a reaction, a crack in the glass. I took a breath, the cold air filling my lungs one last time. I was done being the observer. I was done being the victim. Tonight, I was going to be the variable that the equation couldn't solve. I struck the flare. The sound of the flare igniting was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that silent clearing. It began with a sharp crack, followed instantly by a hiss that sounded like a living thing inhaling in shock. A brilliant, blinding crimson light erupted from the tip of the magnesium stick, tearing through the monochromatic gloom of the night. The red glow washed over the gray stones, the pale trees, and the black water, transforming the world into a landscape of blood and shadow. The heat was intense, radiating against my hand, even to the glove, a fierce, chaotic energy that felt wonderfully, terrifyingly real. I held the flare high, like a torch against the darkness. The smoke billowed up, thick and acrid, choking the sterile air with the smell of burning chemicals. For a moment, nothing happened. The lake simply sat there, absorbing the red light, remaining as impassive as a tombstone. But then, the surface began to react. It didn't boil. It didn't steam. It shivered. A vibration started in the center of the lake, a low-frequency hum that I felt in the soles of my boots before I heard it with my ears. The perfect mirror surface began to distort. The inverted reflection of the trees twisted and writhed, as if the forest below was being tortured. The water, if it was water, began to pull away from the shore, receding slightly, then surging back, lapping against the stones, a sound that wasn't a splash, but a wet, sticky slap. I see you. I shouted, the adrenaline flooding my system. I see what you are. I swung my arm back and hurled the flare. It arced through the air, a spinning comet of red fire, trailing smoke. It hit the center of the lake. I expected it to sink. I expected the water to extinguish it, or at least dampen the light. But the flare didn't sink. It sat on the surface, sizzling and burning with renewed fury, and the water around it began to scream. It was a sound that defied description, a high-pitched, harmonic resonance like the singing of 1,000 crystal glasses, overlaid with a deep, guttural grinding like tectonic plates shifting. The water recoiled from the heat. The black liquid peeled back, creating a depression around a burning flare, revealing not a muddy bottom, but nothing, just a void, a hole in the fabric of the lake where the heat was too intense for the illusion to hold. And then the figures appeared. They rose from the shoreline, emerging from the shadows of the trees like diverse surfacing from deep water. There were dozens of them, men and women in ranger uniforms. Some were old, wearing the olive drab of the 1940s. Others wore the gray of the 70s. I saw Coleman. I saw the woman I had seen in the archives. I saw faces I didn't recognize, but whose eyes held the same vacant, hollow stare. They stood in a ring around the lake, their bodies stiff, their expressions slack. They were the bridge, the collection. The Library of Souls the Lake had archived, but as the flare burned brighter, sputtering its magnesium fury, the figures began to flicker. They didn't move, they wavered, like a bad television signal. Their edges blurred, their solidity compromised. The introduction of pure, chaotic energy was destabilizing projection. Let them go, I yelled, though I knew I was shouting at a force of nature, not a person. The water churned violently now. The center of the lake, where the flare was still burning, began to rise. A mound of black liquid pushed upward, defying gravity, sculpting itself into a shape. It was huge, towering 10 feet above the surface, a fluid, shifting monolith that constantly rearranged itself. One moment it looked like a tree, the next a human face, the next a geometric impossibility of angles and curves. The entity had risen. It turned its attention to me. I felt the weight of its gaze, a physical pressure that made my knees buckle. It wasn't looking at me with eyes. It was perceiving me with its entire mass. The voice that filled my head wasn't sound. It was thought poured directly into my brain like ice water. Chaos, it resonated. You bring fire to the temple of order. I bring reality. I countered, backing away as the water surged onto the shore, the level rising rapidly. I bring the end of the reflection. There's Eno Yendi. The voice boomed, vibrated my teeth. Only the cycle. We are the original. You are the echo. The echo cannot destroy the source. The frozen rangers on the shore began to dissolve. They didn't melt. They simply unspooled, turning into mist that drifted toward a central mass, being reabsorbed into collective. Coleman's face was the last to go, a look of peaceful resignation washing over his features before he became just another wisp of fog. The water was rushing toward me now, moving faster than water should, reaching out with tendrils of black glass. The flare sputtered and died, swallowed finally by the mass, plunging the clearing back into darkness. But it wasn't total darkness. The water itself was glowing now, a faint bioluminescent blue that pulsed with the rhythm of a slow, giant heart. I turned to run, but my feet were heavy, sluggish. The air had thickened. The distance to the tree line seemed to have stretched, the perspective warping like a hallway in a nightmare. I was running, but I wasn't moving. The inversion was expanding. The lake was no longer contained by the shore. It was bleeding out, swallowing the forest, swallowing the world. Submit, the voice whispered, intimate and cold in my ear. Return to the clarity. I stumbled, my boot catching on a root that felt more like a tentacle. I fell hard. The breath knocked out of me. I rolled over, looking up. The wave was cresting above me, a wall of black water, ready to crash down. In that moment, staring up at the inevitable, I realized the flare hadn't failed. It had forced the entity to show its true form. It had forced the confrontation. I wasn't going to outrun it. I wasn't going to escape. The logic of the reflection was closing the loop. So I did the only thing that made sense in a world that had lost its mind. I stopped fighting the gravity. I stood up, facing the wave. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the cold, metallic air, and stepped forward into the water. The impact was not what I expected. There was no splash, no crushing weight of water collapsing on top of me. Instead, it felt like stepping through a veil of cold silk. One moment I was standing on the shore, the next I was inside the substance. It wasn't like being underwater. I could breathe, or at least I didn't feel the need to hold my breath. The medium around me was thick, supporting my weight, suspending me in a void of twilight blue. I opened my eyes. The world had vanished. The trees, the rocks, the sky, all gone. I was floating in an infinite, featureless expanse. But I wasn't alone. Surrounding me, stretching out in every direction, were images, screens, windows, millions of them, suspended in the blue void like a constellation of memories. I drifted closer to one. It showed a scene of a family eating dinner in a brightly lit kitchen. I recognized the father. It was a ranger from the 1940s. I drifted to another, a young couple walking in a park. Coleman was there, laughing, holding the woman's hand. These weren't just images. They were lives. They were the timelines that the lake had absorbed, the echoes it had collected, and among them I saw myself. I saw thousands of versions of Michael Torres. I saw a Michael who never left Boston, who stayed in the marriage and grew old in the city apartment. I saw a Michael who quit the ranger service after a year. I saw a Michael who died in the fishing accident at 12 years old. I saw a Michael who was right-handed. I saw a Michael who was left-handed. The entity wasn't just a mirror of the present. It was an archive of the possible. It was a place where all the paths not taken were stored. The reflections weren't monsters trying to replace us. They were the versions of us that had been discarded by the collapse of probability. They were the ghosts of what could have been, preserved in the amber of the lake. You see, the voice returned, gentler now, echoing from everywhere at once. We do not destroy. We keep. We remember. I floated in the center of the archive, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. But you trap us, I thought, my mind projecting the words. You take the living and turn them into this. We bridge the gap, the entity replied. The barrier between what is and what could be is painful. We seek to heal the separation, to make the many one. I looked at my own hands. In this space, they were translucent, glowing with the same inner light as the water. The scar was gone from both hands. I was perfect here, unblemished. Oh, it was tempting. I felt a peace settling over me, a seduction of the spirit. I could stay here. I could live in any of these memories. I could be the Michael who was happy. I could be the Michael who wasn't lonely. I could be the Michael who never found the lake. All I had to do was let go. All I had to do was allow my consciousness to dissolve into collective. But then I saw it. Drifting past me was a memory that didn't belong to the archive. It was a jagged, messy, painful image. It showed me sitting in my truck, crying after the divorce hearing. It showed me sitting alone in the cabin, eating cold soup from a can. It showed me looking at the empty negatives in the darkroom, terrified and confused. It was my pain, my real, ugly, necessary pain. The archive was beautiful, but it was static. It was a museum of perfect moments. It lacked the grit of reality. It lacked the entropy that makes life meaningful. A life without pain isn't a life. It's a picture. I don't want to be kept, I said, my voice vibrating through the fluid. I want to be real. I want the scars. Reality is suffering, the entity whispered. Why choose the flame when you can have the ice? Because the flame burns, I said, and burning means I'm alive. I focus my will. I focus on the scar. I remembered the pain of the hook tearing my skin. I remembered the cold of the water. I remembered the fear. I grabbed hold of that fear and used it as an anchor. I visualized my physical body, the heavy, aging, flawed body lying somewhere on the shore or at the bottom of the lake. I reached for it. The void began to tremble. The screens flickered. The peaceful blue light turned turbulent, darkening to a stormy gray. "You cannot leave," the entity roared, the voice turning jagged. "You are part of the tide now. I am the shore." I shouted back, "I am the rock that breaks the wave." I kicked out, swimming upward through the thickening gel. Resistance pressed against me from all sides, phantom hands grabbing at my ankles, voices whispering sweet promises of oblivion. But I kicked harder. I clawed at the nothingness, pulling myself toward a faint, distant speck of light that I hoped was a surface. My lungs began to burn, a phantom sensation, but a useful one. It reminded me of the need for air, the need for the messy, chaotic atmosphere of Earth. I swam until my muscles screamed, until the light grew brighter, turning from blue to the dirty, beautiful gray of a cloudy night sky. I broke the surface. The transition was violent. One moment I was weightless. The next gravity slammed into me with the force of a hammer. I gasped, sucking in a lungful of freezing, smoke-filled air. I was thrashing in water, real water, cold and wet and heavy. I scrambled toward the bank, my boots finding purchase on the slick stones. I hauled myself out, collapsing onto moss, coughing and retching, expelling the metallic taste of the inversion from my throat. I lay there for a long time, shivering uncontrollably, feeling the rough texture of the ground against my cheek. I looked up. The lake was quiet. The flare was gone. The water was still, but it looked different now. It looked dead. Just water. Dark. Deep but empty. The sense of presence was gone. The entity had retreated. Or perhaps I had simply been ejected. I sat up, wrapping my arms around myself. I was soaked to the bone. I was freezing. But I was here. I looked at my hands in the moonlight. I held them up, trembling. On my left hand, the scar was there, the jagged white line across the palm. I looked at my right hand. The scar was there too, identical. I checked my arms. The birthmark on my right forearm was there, but there was also a faint, new mark on my left forearm mirroring it. I froze. I touched my face. The mole on my left cheek was there, and now there was a matching one on my right. I hadn't escaped unchanged. The entity was right. The echo cannot destroy the source. But I hadn't been destroyed either. I had survived, but I had brought the mirror with me. I was symmetrical now. I was a living paradox. I carried the history of both timelines etched into my skin. I stood up, swaying slightly. The forest was quiet, but it was a normal silence now. The crickets were starting to chirp again. The wind was moving the branches. The world had rebooted. I walked back to my truck, my dual scars throbbing in unison. I was alive. I was real, but I was no longer just Michael Torres. I was the bridge that had refused to burn. And as I drove away, leaving the lake behind in the darkness, I wondered which version of me was driving, and which version was just along for the ride. Or if, finally, we were both one and the same. The drive back to my cabin was an act of pure animal instinct. My hands, both scarred now, moved on the steering wheel with a memory that was no longer exclusively mine. I felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were a passenger in my own body, watching a film of my own life unfold. The world outside the truck, the dark trees, the winding mountain road, the familiar glow of distant houses, seemed both intimately known and utterly alien. I was a man returning home, but home no longer felt like a place I belonged. I was a ghost haunting the architecture of my own past. I parked the truck and stumbled into the cabin. The shivering had subsided, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I stripped off my soaking clothes, letting them fall in a heap on the floor, a tangible reminder of the impossible baptism I had just survived. I walked into the bathroom and stood before the mirror, not out of fear this time, but out of a clinical necessity. I needed to see the result of the change. The man in the mirror was me, but he was also not me. The symmetry was the most jarring aspect. The two moles on my cheeks, perfectly balanced. The two faint scars on my palms, one on each hand, glowing pale against the skin. My face seemed settled. The lines of stress that had etched themselves around my eyes for years had softened. The perpetual look of worry that had been my constant companion since the divorce was gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling calm. I looked like a man who had seen the end of the world, and found it to be not an ending, but a transformation. I turned on the shower, letting the hot water cascade over me. It felt strange, foreign. The sensation of heat on my skin was muted, as if my nerve had been wrapped in a thin layer of insulation. The cold of the lake still lingered in my bones, not as a temperature, but as a state of being. I was no longer just a creature of warmth and entropy. I carried the cold, ordered stillness of the inversion within me. I slept for 18 hours. It wasn't a restful sleep. It was a coma. I sank into a dreamless black void, my body and mind knitting themselves back together, integrating the two timelines that now coexisted within me. When I finally awoke, it was late afternoon on the following day. Sunlight streamed through the cabin window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, a single blissful moment, everything felt normal. But then I sat up and the memories flooded back. I remembered the flare. I remembered the screaming water. I remembered the archive of souls. And I remembered the scars. I looked at my hands. Both sets of memories, the fishing hook and fallen rocks, were there, clear and distinct. I didn't feel like two people sharing a body. I felt like one person who had lived two lives simultaneously. The contradiction no longer caused a feeling of vertigo. It just was. I got dressed and made coffee, my movements slow and deliberate. The world felt different. The coffee tasted richer. The texture of the wooden table under my fingertips was more pronounced. The colors of the autumn leaves outside the window were more vibrant. It was as if my plunge into the lake had cleansed my senses, stripping away the filter of familiarity and allowing me to perceive the world with the raw, unedited intensity of a newborn. Or perhaps the lake had given me its senses, the ability to see the world not as a collection of objects, but as a web of interconnected energies. I spent the rest of the day in quiet observation. I walked through the woods near my cabin, but I didn't follow the trails. I moved through the trees with a new kind of awareness. I could feel the life in the forest, not as individual creatures, but as a single, breathing entity. I could feel the network of roots beneath my feet, the flow of water through the soil, the slow, patient life of the trees. The forest was no longer a place I worked. It was a place I belonged to. I returned to the cabin as dusk fell. I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back to being a ranger. How could I patrol trails and file reports when I knew the true nature of the map? The life I had lived before finding the lake was over. It was a memory, a story about another man. I needed to find a new path, a new purpose. But what does a man who has touched the source code of reality do next? I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The fire felt good. It was chaotic, warm, and alive, the antithesis of the lake's cold order. But I no longer feared the cold. I understood it. I carried it. I was a balance point between the two states. That's when I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. It was an official Forest Service truck, its headlights cutting through the twilight. I tensed, my first thought being that Jane had sent someone to check on me. But as the truck came to a stop, I saw that it was a younger ranger, someone I didn't recognize. He got out of the truck and walked to my door, his footsteps hesitant on the gravel path. He looked young, barely out of his 20s, with a serious expression on his face. He knocked on the door. I didn't answer immediately. I studied him through the window. There was something familiar about him, the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders. He knocked again, more insistently this time. "Dad," he called out, his voice wavering with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Dad, are you in there?" "It's Jacob." My heart stopped. Jacob, in my original timeline, the one I had lived for 45 years. I had no children. My ex-wife and I had tried, but it was a quiet sorrow that had shadowed our marriage. I had never been a father, but as I heard the name, Another set of memories bloomed in my mind, as real and potent as any I had ever known. I remembered holding a baby in my arms. I remembered teaching a young boy how to fish. I remembered arguing with a teenager about borrowing the truck. I remembered a son. My son, Jacob. I stumbled to the door, my hand shaking as I reached the knob. I opened it. The young man on the porch stared at me, his eyes wide. "Dad," he breathed. "It's you. I found you." And then he threw his arms around me, holding on with a desperate strength. I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling. I was hugging a stranger who was also my son. I was living a memory that had never happened. The lake hadn't just changed me. It had changed my entire world. And standing on my porch, holding my son who shouldn't exist, I realized that I hadn't just brought the mirror back with me. I had stepped through it completely. We sat at the kitchen table, a pot of fresh coffee brewing on the stove. Its familiar aroma, a strange counterpoint to the impossible situation. The young man, Jacob, sat across from me, his eyes never leaving my face. He looked at me with a mixture of awe, relief, and a deep, soul-weary sadness. He had my wife's eyes, I realized. Or rather, he had the eyes of the woman who had been my wife in his timeline. He began to talk, his voice tumbling out in a rush, a story that had clearly been held back for a long time. "I never gave up looking," he said, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. "After you disappeared, they all said you were gone. They said you must have had an accident in the deep woods, or maybe you just left. After Mom passed, they said you were never the same. But I knew you wouldn't just leave, not without a word." My mind struggled to keep up. In his reality, my ex-wife had passed away, and I had disappeared. When did I disappear? I asked, my voice hoarse. 3 years ago, Jacob said, his brow furrowed with confusion. "You went out on a routine patrol in October and never came back. We searched for months, found your truck at the Felton trailhead, but that was it. It was like you just vanished. 3 years. To me, it had been a matter of days since I first found the lake. To this young man, I had been a ghost for 3 years. The temporal inconsistency of the lake, the quality of being both primordial and newly formed, had manifested in my own life. I had been unstuck in time, existing in a pocket dimension while the world outside marched on. "I kept coming back," Jacob continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I joined the ranger service so I could keep searching for you on my own time. I walked every trail in this forest, every inch of Sector 7. The other rangers think I'm crazy. They call me the ghost hunter. But I knew you were out here somewhere. I could feel it." He could feel it. He had a connection to me, a bond that transcended the fractured reality. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain to this boy, this man who was my son, that he was a paradox? How could I tell him that in the world I remembered, he had never been born? The joy of his presence was inextricably tangled with the horror of what it implied. "I found your logbook," he said, pulling a worn, leather-bound journal from his pack. It was my personal journal, not the official ranger log. It was in the cabin, the last entry. He opened it to a bookmark page. I looked at the page. The handwriting was mine, but it was shaky, desperate. It was the writing of a man on the edge of a great change. October 29th, 1989. The lake is calling me back. I can feel it pulling at me, even here. I have to understand what it is. For Sarah, for Jacob. I have to make sure it can't reach them. I'm going back one last time. If I'm not back by morning, burn this cabin to the ground. Don't let it follow me. Tears welled in Jacob's eyes. "You went back for us," he whispered, "to protect us." I knew it. I stared at the entry. I didn't remember writing it, but I also did. The memory was there, a perfect, crystalline image of me sitting at this very table, writing those words by candlelight, feeling a fierce, protective love for a wife who was already gone and a son I had to keep safe. The two timelines were merging, weaving together into a single, cohesive narrative. I was no longer just a man from the world without a son. I was also the man from the world who had lost everything but his son. I'm here now, Jacob, I said, the words feeling true and false at the same time. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. He gripped it tightly. He looked at my hand, his gaze falling on the scar on my right palm. Then he frowned. He turned my hand over and looked at the matching scar on my left palm. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "You only had the scar on your right hand." The question hung in the air between us. Here was the seam. Here was the stitch where the two realities had been sewn together, a visible reminder of the impossibility of my return. I took a deep breath. I couldn't lie to him. He deserved the truth, as incomprehensible as it was. "I found something in the woods, Jacob." I began, choosing my words carefully. A place that isn't on any map. A place where the rules are different. I went into it, and when I came out, I was changed. I brought a piece of it back with me. Jacob listened, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, fearful understanding. He was a child of these woods. He knew the stories, the whispers, the places the other rangers avoided. He had probably heard talk of a looking-glass pond. "You found a lake," he said, his voice barely audible. "The one from the old stories." I nodded slowly. "I did." We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle hiss of the coffee pot. He didn't pull his hand away. He just held mine, tracing the lines of the two impossible scars. He was not a child anymore. He was a man who had spent 3 years searching for his lost father, and in doing so, had prepared himself for a truth far stranger than he could have ever imagined. "So, what now?" he asked finally. "Are you back?" I looked at him, at this impossible, wonderful boy who was my son. I looked at the 2 scars on my hands, at the cabin that was and wasn't my home. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't think back is the right word. I think I'm something new." And in that moment, I realized my purpose. I wasn't meant to run from the lake. I wasn't meant to destroy it. I was meant to be its guardian. I was the bridge, the man who existed in 2 worlds at once. My journey wasn't over. It had just begun. And now I wasn't alone. I had a son who had found me across the fractured boundary of reality itself. The weeks that followed my return were a period of quiet adjustment. My son, Jacob, did not leave the cabin. He arranged a leave of absence from his own ranger duties, citing a family emergency, and stayed with me. We existed in a bubble of time, 2 men trying to understand the new shape of their reality. We talked for hours, late into the night, piecing together the 2 histories that I carried within me. He told me about the 3 years I had been gone, the memorial service they held, the way the community had mourned, the way he had stubbornly refused to let go of my truck. I told him about the life I remembered, a life where I had been alone, where he had never been born. We discovered that our memories were not in conflict, but rather they were complementary. It was as if my mind had expanded to hold both narratives. I could remember the silence in my lonely apartment in Boston, and I could remember the sound of Jacob laughing as a toddler in this very cabin. The pain of the divorce was still there, sharp and real, but it was now softened by the memory of a wife I had loved until the end. I was a mosaic of 2 men, fused together by the impossible physics of the lake. But the lake was not done with us. I could feel it. The cold in my bones never fully left. It was a constant, low-level hum, a reminder of the connection I now had to source. And Jacob felt it too. He confessed that ever since he found me, his dreams had changed. He dreamed of water. He dreamed of inverted forests. He dreamed of the silence, so profound it woke him up gasping for air. One evening, as the first snow of November began to fall, blanketing the forest in white, I knew it was time. I looked at Jacob across the firelight. He was reading, but his eyes were distant, focused on something unseen. "We have to go back," I said softly. He looked up, not surprised. "I know. It's calling you, isn't it?" "It's calling us." I corrected him. You're part of this now, Jacob. You're the anchor that pulled me out. That connection goes both ways. We packed our gear in silence. The drive to the trailhead was somber, a pilgrimage to a holy and terrible place. The snow was falling heavily now, erasing the world, turning the familiar woods into a blank canvas. We hiked the Felton Trail, our breath steaming in the cold air. When we reached the divergence, the path that shouldn't be there, it was open and waiting. The snow seemed to shy away from it, leaving the dark earth exposed. We walked down into the valley, into the silence. The clearing was exactly as I had left it. The lake was a vast, black eye staring up at the snow-filled sky. The water was still, unfrozen despite the freezing temperatures. It was immune to the weather, immune to the seasons. We stood side by side on the shore. I looked at my reflection. It was perfect, symmetrical. It looked back at me with a calm acceptance. And next to it, I saw Jacob's reflection. But his reflection wasn't just standing there. It was reaching out to mine. It wants balance, I said, realizing the truth of it. It doesn't just want to copy us. It wants to integrate us. It's lonely. It's an entire universe trapped in a single point, desperate for connection. Jacob stepped closer to the water. So what do? Jump in? No, I said, gripping his shoulder. We don't go in. We stay here. We become the bridge. We accept the duality. We accept that we are both real and unreal, both shadow and source. We sat down on the cold stones of the shore. We didn't speak. We just watched the water. And as we watched, something miraculous happened. The snow began to land on the surface. But instead of melting or sinking, the snowflakes sat there, perfect and intact. And then, slowly they began to glow. The lake was responding to us. It was responding to our acceptance. The bioluminescent blue light I had seen before returned, but it wasn't violent this time. It was gentle. It pulsed in time with our breathing. The water began to rise, not as a wave, but as a mist. A thick, glowing fog rolled off the surface and enveloped us. I felt the barrier between us dissolve. I could feel Jacob's thoughts as clearly as my own. I could feel his love, his fear, his hope, and he could feel mine. We were no longer two separate individuals. We were a single consciousness, shared across two bodies, anchored by the lake. We sat there for what felt like hours, or perhaps lifetimes. The sun rose, but it was a different sun. It was the sun of the inverted world, pale and distant. We were sitting on the shore of the true reality, looking out at the reflection of the world we had left behind. And it was beautiful. We are the synthesis. Jacob's voice echoed in my mind, or perhaps he spoke it aloud. We are the proof that both worlds can exist. I looked at my hands. The scars were glowing with the same blue light as a mist. I understood now. I wasn't just a ranger anymore. I was a keeper. I was the guardian of the seam. I had to stay here, close to the source, to ensure that the two realities remained in balance. If I left, the tear would widen. The lake would bleed out again. I have to stay, I said. I know, Jacob replied. And so do I. We didn't need to discuss it. It was the only way. We would maintain the outpost. We would watch over the lake, ensuring that no one else stumbled into the inversion unprepared. We would be the stewards of the impossible. The years have passed differently for us since that night. Time in the deep woods of October Mountain does not move in a straight line. Sometimes it loops. Sometimes it stands still. We have become part of the folklore of the forest. The two rangers who are always out on patrol, who appear when hikers are lost, guiding them back to the main trail before they can find the divergence. We live in the cabin, but the cabin has changed. It exists in a state of flux, sometimes appearing weathered and old, sometimes fresh and new. We have learned to navigate the shifts. We have learned to live with the duality. I still have the memories of the lonely life, and I have the memories of the life with my son. They no longer conflict. They are simply different chapters of the same book. The lake remains our charge. It is quiet now. The screaming has stopped. The reflections no longer try to escape. They seem content to watch us, to learn from us. We sit by the shore often, communicating with the entities in the water. We write in our notebooks, and they write back. We are teaching them about humanity, about pain, about love, about the beauty of entropy. And they are teaching us about stillness, about eternity, about the perfection of order. It is a strange existence, I admit, to be a living bridge between realities, but it is a peaceful one. I have found the purpose I was looking for when I first came to these mountains. I am no longer running away. I am standing exactly where I need to be. But I am telling you this story now because the balance is shifting again. The world outside is changing. It is becoming faster, louder, more chaotic. The noise of your reality is bleeding into ours. The signal is getting stronger, and the lake is reacting. It is waking up. I need you to understand that what you see in the mirror is not just light bouncing off glass. It is a window, and windows can be opened from both sides. When you look at your reflection tomorrow morning, look closely. Watch for the delay. Watch for the smile that you didn't make. We are watching from this side. We are holding the line. But we are only two men. The lake is vast, and its hunger for connection is infinite. If you ever find yourself in the Berkshires, walking the Felton Trail in the autumn, and you see a fork in the path that isn't on your map, do not follow it. Turn around. Go back to the noise. Go back to your linear time. Because once you see the true face of the world, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to being just a shadow. My name is Michael Torres. I am a ranger of the October Mountain State Forest. And I am also a reflection, looking out at you from the other side of the glass. The story ends here, but the circle continues. Every time you tell this story, every time you think about the lake, you make it a little more real. You add another layer to the reflection. So be careful with your thoughts. Be careful with your memories. Because somewhere in a quiet clearing in the woods, a black lake is waiting. And it knows your name. It has known you since before you were born. And it is patiently, silently, waiting for you to come home. Thank you for listening. Keep your eyes open. And remember, the person looking back at you in the mirror might just be the real one. Good night.